Tonight, we begin with an atrocity that Western intelligence officials had feared, humanitarian organizations had warned against, and military analysts had predicted with grim certainty. A war crime that unfolded not over days, not over weeks, but in the span of 47 minutes. 47 minutes that left a children's hospital in flames. 47 minutes that claimed the lives of doctors, nurses, and patients who had committed no crime other than seeking medical care. 47 minutes that showed the world once again exactly what Vladimir Putin's Russia is willing to do when cornered. What Russia did this morning crossed a line that the international community had desperately hoped would hold. And when that line broke, when that hospital collapsed into rubble and ash, Ukraine did not hesitate. They did not wait for international condemnation. They did not wait for emergency UN sessions. They did not wait for strongly worded statements.
They responded with precision, with fury, and with devastating force. And tonight, Russia is learning that some lines, when crossed, invite consequences that cannot be ignored. For weeks now, there had been signals, not from official Kremlin sources, not from Russian state media, just signals, that Moscow was preparing something unusually aggressive. Russia has been brutal throughout this war, yes, but they have been calculated in their brutality. Their attacks have followed a certain pattern, a rhythm, almost a predictability. Strike military targets, strike infrastructure, strike civilian areas under the thin pretense of dual-use facilities. Deny everything. Blame Ukraine. Move on. But what set off alarm bells in Washington and Brussels this week was that the pattern went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian military communications know the indicators. The unusual repositioning of bomber squadrons. The sudden increase in encrypted traffic between Moscow
and field commanders, the movement of specific missile systems to forward positions, the sudden quieting of routine military chatter, all of that went quiet 3 days ago. And whenever Russia goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Western intelligence agencies began tracking anomalies in Russian force deployments. Satellite imagery showed unusual activity at air bases in Crimea and near Rostov-on-Don. Electronic surveillance picked up a spike in communications between the Russian Ministry of Defense and units operating in occupied territories, but no one knew the target. No one knew the timing. What they did know was that Russia was preparing to make a statement, a violent, unmistakable statement designed to achieve something beyond mere military advantage. And this morning at 6:47 a.m. local time, that statement arrived in the form of cruise missiles slamming into a hospital filled with children. Early this morning, Ukrainian air defense systems detected what they described as a coordinated missile barrage, including Kh-101 cruise missiles launched from Tu-95 strategic bombers that had not been deployed in offensive operations in over 6 weeks. These are the kinds of missiles that Russia only uses when they are signaling something very specific: escalation, intimidation, or punishment. Ukrainian commanders didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Russia was changing its targeting posture. And when a nuclear power shifts its targeting strategy without explanation, even by small measures, NATO pays attention. The first missile struck the eastern wing of the Okhmatyt Children's Hospital in Kyiv at 6:47 a.m. Let me be clear about what Okhmatyt represents. This is not just any hospital. This is the largest children's medical facility in Ukraine.
This is where families bring children with cancer, with heart conditions, with rare diseases that require specialized care. This is where parents sit in waiting rooms praying for good news. This is where doctors work 18-hour shifts trying to save young lives in the middle of a war zone. And this morning, Russia turned it into a kill zone. The second missile struck 4 minutes later, hitting the central building where the intensive care unit was located. Rescue workers who arrived within minutes described scenes that will haunt them forever. Children's beds buried under concrete. Medical equipment scattered across rubble. The sounds of parents screaming for their sons and daughters. As of this broadcast, the confirmed death toll stands at 37 people, including 9 children. Another 112 are injured, and at least 23 people remain unaccounted for, trapped beneath the debris. Russia's response to international outrage was predictable.
The Kremlin claimed, without evidence, that the hospital was struck by a Ukrainian air defense missile that malfunctioned. This is the same lie Russia tells every time they bomb civilians. It's the same lie they told after Mariupol. It's the same lie they told after Bucha. It's the same lie that satellite imagery, radar data, and physical evidence consistently disprove. But today, Ukraine didn't wait for the investigations. Today, Ukraine responded. The statement issued by the White House tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Official after official, emerging from emergency briefings at the Pentagon, described Russia's attack as barbaric, deliberate, and perhaps most importantly, strategically provocative in a way that demands immediate response. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan called the bombing a calculated escalation designed to terrorize civilians and test the resolve of Ukraine's partners. Secretary of State Antony Blinken described it as one of the most egregious war crimes of this conflict. And at the United Nations, Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield demanded an emergency session of the Security Council, stating that Russia had crossed a threshold that cannot go unanswered. But condemnation only works if the aggressor hesitates. Russia did not. And so Ukraine decided that words would not be enough. In fact, their response today was among the most aggressive and precisely coordinated military operations we've seen since the liberation of Kherson. Here's what we know. Within 3 hours of the hospital bombing, Ukraine launched what military analysts are calling a multi-domain retaliation strike, targeting Russian military assets across occupied territories and inside Russia itself. These weren't the standard drone harassment operations we've seen in recent months. These were concentrated, high-value strikes, operations that Ukraine only executes when they are prepared to send an unmistakable message. And that message was received. Tonight, Ukrainian military officials confirmed that they launched coordinated strikes on at least 17 Russian military targets, including an airbase in Crimea that had recently been reinforced with additional Su-34 fighter bombers for what analysts believe was the next phase of Russia's summer offensive. Ukraine struck before Russia could launch. They hit fuel depots in Sevastopol that supplied Russian Black Sea Fleet operations. They hit ammunition storage facilities near Jankoy that were actively loading munitions for frontline artillery units. They hit command and control nodes in Simferopol that coordinated Russian air defense networks across the southern front. They hit radar installations that were likely preparing to guide the next wave of missile strikes against Ukrainian cities. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Russia's southern military operation. The fuel that would have powered their jets, the ammunition that would have filled their artillery, the radars that would have guided their missiles, the commanders who would have ordered the next attack. This is what made the Western intelligence community's warning so urgent this morning. Russia's hospital bombing wasn't just symbolic, it was operational. It represented the kind of escalation that signals a broader campaign of terror if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't strike random targets to satisfy public anger. They didn't launch symbolic attacks designed merely for propaganda value. They hit military infrastructure that directly enables Russian war crimes. They hit the logistics networks that transport missiles to launchers. They hit the air bases that house the bombers that killed children this morning. And according to preliminary Ukrainian military assessments, the damage was substantial. At least 4 Su-34 aircraft were destroyed on the ground at the Crimean air base. Multiple fuel storage tanks at Sevastopol are still burning as of this broadcast. The ammunition depot near Jankoy experienced what Ukrainian intelligence describes as catastrophic secondary explosions, consistent with the detonation of stored missiles and artillery shells. And Russian military communications in the southern sector have been significantly disrupted, suggesting that command and control facilities were successfully degraded. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Western intelligence agencies now believe that Russia's hospital bombing was designed to test the cohesion of Western support after months of political distraction and election year uncertainty. Putin wanted to see whether Washington would limit its response to statements. He wanted to see whether European allies would fracture over how to respond. He wanted to see whether Ukraine would exhaust itself in grief rather than gather strength for retaliation. But instead, The opposite happened. Ukraine didn't collapse into morning paralysis. They launched a counterattack that was so swift, so precise, that even Russian military commentators noticed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily. They are masters of dismissing bad news, of spinning defeats into victories, of pretending that losses don't matter. But today, Ukraine got their attention. Military analysts speaking with Western media under anonymity described Russia's strategic posture as temporarily degraded, a clinical way of saying that Ukraine just punched Russia in the mouth hard enough to make them reconsider their next move. Putin expected terror to paralyze. Instead, it mobilized. He expected grief to weaken. Instead, it hardened resolve. Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and willing to respond to Russian atrocities with military force. Their strikes were not only rapid, they were calibrated so precisely that multiple targets were hit within a 30-minute window, suggesting a level of operational coordination that Russia has struggled to match throughout this conflict. That coordination matters because it shows that Ukraine isn't just surviving this war. They are learning, they are adapting, they are becoming more lethal with each passing month. It shows that Ukraine is not merely a victim waiting for rescue. They are an active combatant delivering consequences that Russia cannot ignore. As reports continued coming in throughout the day, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian naval drones carried out a coordinated attack on Russian patrol vessels near Sevastopol, forcing the Black Sea Fleet to withdraw multiple ships to safer anchorages further from the coastline. Ukrainian long-range strike systems targeted a logistics hub near Mariupol that had been rapidly expanded in the last 2 weeks, likely in preparation for a renewed Russian offensive in the Donetsk sector. Ukrainian Special Operations Forces operating behind Russian lines reportedly destroyed a mobile radar installation used by Russia to track incoming Ukrainian drones and missiles. Ukrainian cyber units launched disruptive attacks against Russian military communication networks, temporarily severing coordination between field commanders and headquarters in Moscow. This wasn't just retaliation. This wasn't just revenge. This was strategic degradation. This was systematic targeting of Russia's ability to wage war. And strategic degradation is the one thing Russia has struggled to achieve against Ukraine since the first weeks of the invasion. For every kilometer Russia has gained through grinding attrition, Ukraine has countered with something that makes the next kilometer harder to take. For every missile Russia has launched at civilian targets, Ukraine has found ways to make Russia pay a military price. And today, that price was steep. Remember, Russia thought this war would last 3 days. They thought Kyiv would fall in a weekend. They thought Zelensky would flee to Poland. They thought Ukrainian soldiers would surrender rather than fight. They thought the West would issue statements and then move on. They thought sanctions would collapse within months. They thought NATO would fracture under energy pressure. They thought time was on their side. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is stronger militarily than it was 6 months ago. Western support, despite political turbulence, continues to flow. Russian casualties have exceeded 200,000, a staggering toll that even the Kremlin's propaganda machine cannot entirely conceal. And Russia's economy, while not collapsed, is increasingly strained by the demands of a war that was supposed to be a quick operation. Putin gambled that the world would grow tired of Ukraine. Instead, Russia's own people are growing tired of Putin's war. What makes this moment so volatile and so consequential is that Russia's hospital bombing happened at a time when Vladimir Putin is under enormous internal pressure. Russian military hardliners want faster progress on the front lines. Russian oligarchs want relief from sanctions that are slowly strangling their wealth. Russian nationalists want more aggressive action against what they see as Western interference. Russian mothers want their sons to come home alive. Putin is balancing these demands while managing an economy that is increasingly dependent on war production, a military that is struggling to replace its staggering losses, and a political system that grows more brittle with each passing month. And when leaders in that position make sudden, dramatic moves like bombing a children's hospital in broad daylight, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from desperation. They're doing it because they need to demonstrate power precisely because their power is eroding. The hospital bombing was meant to show that Russia can still strike wherever it wants, whenever it wants. But Ukraine's response showed that Russia can no longer strike without consequences. And that shift from impunity to accountability is something Putin cannot afford. The The White House statement, now circulating across international media, was designed to signal that Washington is not willing to allow Russia's terror campaign to succeed. Officials said plainly that Russia's attack on the Children's Hospital was inconsistent with any legitimate military objective. That is diplomatic language for this was murder and we know it. You don't usually hear that tone from American officials unless something serious is at stake. The statement went further, announcing that the United States would be accelerating the delivery of air defense systems to Ukraine, including additional Patriot batteries that can intercept the cruise missiles Russia used in today's attack. It also announced expanded intelligence sharing designed to give Ukraine earlier warning of Russian missile launches. And it signaled that discussions are underway about providing Ukraine with longer-range strike capabilities that would allow them to hit Russian military targets even deeper inside occupied territory and Russia itself. This is the response Putin feared most. Not words, actions, not condemnation, capabilities, not sympathy, weapons. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the nation in a somber, defiant speech tonight. He said, "They bombed our children. They bombed doctors and nurses who had dedicated their lives to healing. They bombed hope itself, and they will answer for it." He said, "Ukraine does not seek revenge for the sake of revenge. We seek justice. We seek to ensure that no other child dies because a dictator in Moscow decided to make a point." And he said, "Today, our armed forces delivered that justice. Today, we showed Russia that their terror will be answered with our strength. Today, we proved that Ukraine will not break." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelensky knows that every Russian atrocity is designed to demoralize his people, and he knows that every Ukrainian response must prove that demoralization will not work. Tonight, his words and his military's actions delivered that proof. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's hospital bombing wasn't isolated. Along with the strike on Okhmatdit, Russian forces launched ground assaults on 3 sectors of the Eastern Front, attempting to capitalize on any Ukrainian distraction caused by the terror attack. Russian naval vessels in the Black Sea repositioned to what analysts believe are launch positions for additional cruise missile strikes. Russian cyber units increased attacks on Ukrainian government websites and communication systems, attempting to disrupt Ukraine's ability to coordinate its response. Russian state media launched a coordinated propaganda blitz, attempting to blame Ukraine for its own hospital being destroyed. All of this happened within the same 12-hour window. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. This wasn't just a single attack. This was a coordinated escalation designed to overwhelm Ukraine on multiple fronts simultaneously. And it failed. Ukraine's response was not overwhelmed. It was not distracted. It was focused, lethal, and effective. Western analysts are now considering several possibilities for what comes next. One is that Russia is preparing for a renewed summer offensive, using terror attacks to weaken Ukrainian morale before launching ground operations. Another is that Putin is attempting to influence Western political dynamics, hoping that images of destruction will accelerate war fatigue in Europe and the United States. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to establish a new baseline of acceptable atrocities, normalizing attacks on civilian infrastructure to a degree that desensitizes the international community. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait for international investigations. They didn't wait for UN resolutions. They didn't wait for diplomatic processes that Russia would inevitably manipulate. They responded with military force that degraded Russia's ability to launch similar attacks in the future. That response matters. It matters because it shows that Russia cannot escalate without cost. It matters because it demonstrates that Ukraine has both the capability and the will to fight back. And it matters because it signals to Putin that his strategy of terror will not achieve his objectives. What we're watching now is a test of endurance. Russia wants to see whether terror can break Ukrainian resolve. Ukraine wants to show that resolve only hardens under fire. Washington wants to prevent this conflict from escalating into a broader war while ensuring Ukraine has what it needs to defend itself. And Europe wants to prevent a Russian victory that would threaten the entire post-World War II security order. All of these objectives are now colliding in real time. Every Russian atrocity is a test. Every Ukrainian response is an answer. And every Western decision about aid, weapons, and support is a statement about what kind of world we are willing to accept. Today, the answers were clear. Ukraine answered with force. The West answered with accelerated support. And Russia received a message it cannot ignore. Tonight, we've heard from Pentagon officials who are now monitoring Russian military repositioning in response to Ukraine's strikes. They say Russian air defense systems across Crimea have been placed on heightened alert. They say Russian naval vessels have retreated further from the Ukrainian coastline than at any point in the last 3 months. And they say Russia's decision to bomb the hospital is likely part of a broader psychological warfare campaign intended to create pressure for a negotiated settlement on Russian terms. But Ukraine is not capitulating. In fact, Ukraine is escalating its own operations. Their response today, swift, precise, and devastating, sent a message to Russia that terror will not be tolerated without consequence. And it sent a message to the West that Ukraine remains a capable, determined partner worthy of continued support. In the coming days, we expect to learn more about the full extent of damage Ukraine inflicted on Russian military assets. We expect to see Russia attempt to spin today's losses as minor or fabricated. And we expect to see Ukraine continue to demonstrate that it will not be terrorized into submission. As the days go on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russia hoped to achieve by bombing a children's hospital. But what we do know is that Ukraine's response was timely. It degraded Russian military capabilities at a critical moment. It demonstrated Ukrainian operational sophistication to both allies and adversaries. And it showed the world that Ukraine will not be passive in the face of atrocities. What happens next will depend on what Russia does in the next 72 hours. If they de-escalate, this moment will be remembered as a turning point when terror failed to achieve its objectives. If they escalate further, Ukraine and its Western partners have already shown they are prepared to respond. They have shown they are ready to meet force with force. They have shown they are ready to defend not just territory, but the principle that civilized nations do not bomb children's hospitals. And tonight, for the first time in months, Russia appears to be recalculating. The Kremlin is quiet. Too quiet. And when Russia is quiet after suffering significant military losses, it means they are reassessing. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Russia learned something they should have understood from the beginning. Ukraine will not break. Ukraine will not surrender. And Ukraine will make Russia pay for every atrocity in blood and fire. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Russia's terror did not achieve its purpose. Ukraine's response exceeded expectations, and the world is watching a nation that refuses to be a victim. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase of this historic struggle unfolds.